Welcome to the Nonviolent Jesus Podcast. I'm John, Father John Deere, and today I'm blessed to speak with Bryan Stevenson, founder of Equal Justice Initiative, talking with me from his office in Montgomery, Alabama. This podcast is a project of www.beatitudecenter.org, where you can find many other podcasts and regular Zoom programs on the nonviolence of Jesus and practicing nonviolence and working for a more just, more nonviolent world. As I like to do, I like to begin with a little prayer, so I invite everybody listening just to take a deep breath wherever you are and just to relax and recenter yourself. And we enter here into the presence of the God of universal love who loves you infinitely and personally and everyone. And let's welcome the nonviolent Jesus with us. Just take a moment to ask for whatever graces and blessings you need to do God's will. God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life and love and peace that you give us. Be with us now as Bryan and I reflect together on your call to work for justice and mercy, to be instruments of peace and inspire us, bless us, disarm us all, strengthen us, and send us all out to do what we can to help you end poverty, racism, greed, injustice, war, and the whole culture of violence and death and destruction, that we might be your beatitude people of universal love, compassion, and peace, your holy peacemakers. In Jesus' name, amen. So it's my great pleasure to welcome today and introduce everybody to the legendary Bryan Stevenson, lawyer, founder, and executive director of Equal Justice Initiative, also professor of law at New York University Law School, and author of the great best-selling book Just Mercy, which is also made into a terrific movie of the same name, which I hope everybody will go and see the movie and read the book. It's one of the greatest books of our time about Bryan's journey from Harvard to Montgomery, Alabama, where he started a small nonprofit to serve those on death row, the poor, the wrongly condemned, those trapped in the furthest reaches of our criminal injustice system. At the heart of the book is the story of Walter McMillian, a young man sentenced to die for a notorious murder he didn't commit. And Bryan has won relief for dozens of condemned prisoners, argued 5 times before the Supreme Court, won many awards, including the MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant. And a couple of years ago, Bryan built, with the support of a lot of people and a lot of money he raised, 2 museums in Montgomery, Alabama, which I have visited. The National Museum of Peace and Justice, a 6-acre hilltop overlooking Montgomery, the nation's first comprehensive memorial dedicated to the legacy of Black Americans who were enslaved, terrorized by lynching, humiliated by racial segregation, and presumed guilty and dangerous. Their names are engraved on more than 800 monuments. The other museum is the Legacy Museum, From Enslavement to Mass Incarceration, it's called, which displays the history of slavery, racial lynchings, segregation, and racial bias in America. And I hope you'll all visit them and go to Montgomery, Alabama. Archbishop Tutu, my friend, called Bryan America's young Nelson Mandela, and rightly so. Bryan Stevenson, thank you so much for joining me today here at this Nonviolent Jesus podcast.
Oh, it's my great pleasure to be with you.
Hey, Bryan, I just have to say from the beginning, on behalf of myself and all the listeners and millions of people, thank you so much for being a voice for justice and mercy and all the beautiful, holy, inspiring work you do. Thank you for everything, Bryan.
I so appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. So I don't know where to begin, and I've been just obsessed with talking about you and rereading your book and studying it. And, your book is now out, a new 10th anniversary edition. Congratulations. It tells your story from Harvard to Alabama and meeting and working with all those people in prison and death row and the rural poor and, wow, taking on the white supremacist establishment and systemic racial injustice, especially your friend Walter. And here we are, 2025, 10 years after your book came out, Bryan. I think things are worse than when you started. I'm 65, been at this for 45 years with our friend Paul Farmer, and things are as bad as ever. And they're getting rid of civil rights and voting rights legislation. We're seeing the rise of white supremacy at a new level with the Trump administration moving into full-blown what? Oligarchy, fascism, authoritarianism, cutting any decent programs. I thought we could just start, Bryan, by you giving us your take on what's happening right now in Alabama and the country in whatever way you want to talk about it.
Well, thank you. I do think we are in a moment where the politics of fear and anger are raging. They are raging in this country, but they're raging all around the world. And what's scary about that is that when societies allow themselves to be governed by fear and anger, they start tolerating things we should never tolerate. We start accepting things we should never accept. When you look at human history, in the worst moments of human history, you can evaluate what happened during those tragic moments and find at the core narratives of fear and anger shaping behavior, shaping policies, shaping the functioning of government. The Holocaust can't be understood without understanding how the Nazis used narratives of fear and anger and directed them at people who are Jewish or people who are gay or people who were Roma to create this horrific violence and destruction. 30 years ago, we saw a genocide in Rwanda where hundreds of thousands of people were killed, and the narratives of fear and anger spread through that country, and just unconscionable things happened. When I look at American history, the parts of our history, the moments in our history when we did the most destructive things, we're being guided by those same narratives of fear and anger. And we're in the midst of that now. We have elected leaders that want everybody angry, that want everybody fearful. And that has put us in this valley that I think you have rightly described as a really troubling time. And so for me, what that means is that those of us who don't want to give in to fear and anger have to become hopeful and courageous. We have to become faithful truth tellers. We have to stand when people say sit down. We have to speak when people say be quiet. The encouraging thing to me about this moment is that we've seen this before. I'm the heir of people who were enslaved in America, the grandson of people who were terrorized during the period of lynching, the child of people who were brutalized by segregation. And my foreparents found a way to cope, to survive, to endure, and to resist these narratives of fear and anger. I started my education in a colored school. They didn't let me go to the public schools. When I got to the public schools after integration, the presumption was I wasn't equipped, wasn't capable, wasn't worthy to be there. And you had to navigate a lot of those presumptions. I think we're better positioned than we've ever been before to overcome these narratives of fear and anger, but it's going to require some work. It's going to require some faith. It's going to require some activism. It's going to require some believing in our capacity to do better than what we're seeing in this particular moment.
Thank you. Maybe we can get more specific a little bit later on. One of the amazing things about your story is, you're at Harvard and you pack up and you move to Alabama, and you had that kind of faith and courage and willingness to stand up and speak out. And you're just one person, and then you end up meeting these other good people, and flash forward, and all this hard work is continuing to bear such good fruit. I guess, did you ever think so? Or what is the lesson there, that you just keep at it and keep being hopeful and stay the course no matter what and watch positive, good work unfold? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, proximity has been a source of power. I grew
yes.
up in a poor, racially segregated community, and as I said, black kids couldn't go to the public schools. Most of the adults that I grew up around didn't have high school degrees because there were literally no high schools for black people in our county when they were teenagers. And then lawyers came into the community and changed everything by enforcing our commitment to the rule of law. And because those lawyers got proximate to poor black kids like me, I got to go to high school, I got to go to college. That's how I got to law school. So I was interested in getting proximate to other people who were disfavored, marginalized, excluded, at risk, and doing for them what others had done for me. And I wrote in Just Mercy about how going to death row when I was a law student completely changed me. Meeting a condemned man on death row, sitting down with him and forgetting that I was a law student and forgetting that he was a condemned prisoner, and just talking to him for 2 or 3 hours, and then getting lost in his humanity and the fellowship we were creating in that horrid space. And then having that visit interrupted by guards who were angry that we were laughing and talking and bonding, and came into the room and grabbed him and put the handcuffs back on his wrist and wrapped the chain around his waist and put the metal shackles on his ankles so violently and started shoving him toward the door. And to see him treated so badly and not be able to stop that mistreatment really alarmed me. But then he got in front of the door before he left that room, and he turned to me and he said, "Bryan, don't worry about this. You just come back." And then he did that thing I'll never forget, where he closed his eyes, threw his head back, and began to sing. And he started singing the hymn, "I'm pressing on the upward way. New heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound." And then he said, "Lord, plant my feet on higher ground." And it stunned everyone. The guards stopped. And then they recovered and started pushing him down the hallway, and you could hear the chains clanging, but you could hear this man singing about higher ground. Hearing his song was like a calling from God. I knew then that I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. And being proximate to this condemned man and hearing his song changed everything for me. I went back to Harvard Law School. You couldn't get me out of the law school library. I needed to know everything about habeas corpus and res judicata and comity and federalism and all of the jurisprudence necessary to help condemned people. And now, some 40 plus years later, if I reflect on my career, if I reflect on the things I've done, if I've helped anybody during my career, if I've made a difference in the lives of my clients, it's not because we work hard. We try to. It's not because we're smart. We try to be smart. It's not because we're tactical. We try to do that too. But if I'm honest, if I've helped anybody during my career, it's because I got close to a condemned man and heard his song. And I still believe, Father, that in jails and prisons, people are singing, in places where people are marginalized and excluded, in places where people have been oppressed and ignored and mistreated, there are songs still being sung. And if we get close enough to hear those melodies, to hear the humanity, to hear God's grace manifest in the lives of the poor and those who are disfavored, we find power, we find strength, we find knowledge, we find wisdom, we find the capacity to make a difference. And that is what has sustained me in Alabama, in my work, is that relationship to God's children who are often neglected, pushed aside, condemned, incarcerated, forgotten.
Oh, thank you so much, Bryan. So we saw, just as President Biden left office, him commute the sentences of 37 people from federal death row. But last week, as we're recording this, we also saw South Carolina execute someone by firing squad. Tell me about the death penalty today and your work to abolish it, and also how it's connected to the larger systemic racism, mass incarceration, police brutality, but also the whole white supremacist culture and the country itself. Now, that's a big and outrageous question, but I'm just trying to, you know what, I'm just, I visited Jackson, Georgia, too, in the 80s and had a close friend on death row, and it helped change my life, and used to get Mother Teresa to make phone calls to intervene with governors. And so I hear you. And yet here we are all these years later, and there's progress and things are worse at the same time. So tell me about
Yeah.
that.
I think justice is a constant struggle. We never get to a place where we can claim that we have won and there will never be injustice. It is a feature of this world that inequality breeds injustice. It breeds abuse of power. It breeds excessive violence. And I do think the death penalty is one of the most dramatic manifestations of that abuse of power. I have always believed that the threshold question that we should be asking when people think about capital punishment is not whether people should deserve to die for the crimes they've committed. The threshold question should be, do we deserve to kill when we have a flawed system, when we have a system that's been compromised by racial bias, when we have a system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent? And that is the system that we've had. We've made a lot of progress over the last 10 years since I wrote Just Mercy. A bunch of states have abolished the death penalty. The number of people on death row has dropped considerably. The number of executions has dropped. But we are still in this struggle, and that execution in South Carolina recently is a painful, heartbreaking reminder of that, where they pulled this man out and lined up people with guns who shot him in a firing squad. We've had executions in Alabama recently where they couldn't kill the person with lethal injection. They kept them on the gurney for hours, poking and prodding, and were never able to successfully kill the person through an injection. So they called off that execution, and then months later took him back and asphyxiated him with nitrogen gas until he suffocated and died. And our society calls that justice. I think it is a remnant of our long history of using violence to maintain certain kinds of power. Before Europeans came to this continent, there were millions of indigenous peoples here who had communities and societies that thrived. And within a very short period of time, those indigenous peoples were forced off their lands. They were subjected to violence and abuse, and the population dwindled. And in the midst of that, we were creating a constitution that talked about equality and justice for all, but we didn't apply those concepts to Native people because we said, oh, no, those Native people, they're different, racially different. And this narrative of racial difference was born in America, and it was like an infection, and it spread. And it was that narrative that was used to justify 246 years of slavery. 10 million Black people were enslaved. 6 million died enslaved. At the end of the Civil War, 4 million were emancipated. But the great evil of that era of slavery for me was this narrative we created because people who enslaved others didn't want to think of themselves as immoral or indecent or unchristian. And so they created a false narrative to help them reckon with the violence and the abuse and the suffering they saw all around them. And this false narrative contended that Black people are not as good as white people. Black people are less capable, less worthy, less human, less evolved. And that false narrative was, for me, the lasting evil of slavery because it survived the Civil War. I often argue that the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. And after emancipation, Black people were still presumed inferior, unworthy. And that's why our efforts during Reconstruction failed. And for a century following the Civil War, Black people were pulled out of their homes, beaten, drowned, tortured, and lynched. And when you understand that history, it's hard to understand how could people in this country tolerate that sort of mob violence, torturing people, subjecting people to horrific violence, burning them alive, all of this horrible stuff. And Congress didn't do anything. Law enforcement didn't do anything. And you can't understand that without understanding this narrative of racial hierarchy, of white supremacy. And that's what created the codified segregation that shaped my early years, this Jim Crow era. And courageous people responded. Dr. King and Rosa Parks and so many others came together here in Montgomery and began a movement that tore down the legal architecture of segregation and Jim Crow, but the narrative persisted. And that's why here in 2025, we're still dealing with manifestations of that narrative, a hostility to diversity, a hostility to equality, a nervousness about treating people equally and fairly, because that might diminish the power of some while creating opportunities for others. It's tragic that even in 2025, you can be talented, you can be wealthy, you can be gifted, you can be a priest, you can be a pastor, you can be kind, you can be loving, but if you're black or brown, you'll go places where you have to navigate this presumption of dangerousness and guilt. And because I'm getting older, I can tell you, when you constantly navigate these presumptions, it's exhausting. And that is why I think we need an era of truth and justice, truth and repair, truth and reconciliation, truth and restoration. Without truth-telling, we cannot free ourselves from the burden of this history. Truth-telling will lead us away from the death penalty. It's when we tell the truth that we'll be able to understand that we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done. Truth will cause us to recognize that if someone tells a lie, they're not just a liar. If someone takes something, they're not just a thief. That even if you kill someone, you're not just a killer. And that is the era, that is the movement that I'm really hoping we can advance in this moment, because I continue to believe that truth is the antidote to quelling fear and anger. It's the antidote to the abuse of power that we see all around it. Truth will set us free. And I think people of faith have a critical role to play in this, because we know that we can't be afraid to be honest about our mistakes. You know, in my church, you can't come in there and say, I want heaven and redemption and salvation and all these wonderful things, but I'm not prepared to admit to anything. I'm not prepared to confess any wrongdoing. We know that confession and repentance is what opens our heart to grace and mercy. And we just have a lot of brothers and sisters in this country that haven't accepted that don't believe that, and they're allowing their anger and their fear to shape their decision-making, their voting, their beliefs, their hostilities toward people who are different. And that's the challenge that we face. And to me, the death penalty is just the most violent and heartbreaking manifestation of that challenge. But we are in a moment where I think we have the capacity to do more and to do better.
Well, thank you so much, Bryan, for your eloquent reflection. I wanted to ask you about your friend, Walter McMillian. He's the center of your book, Just Mercy, and the center of the movie played by Jamie Foxx. And so he was an innocent man condemned to death for a terrible crime, which he didn't do, and mobilizing all kinds of people were able to get him off death row, and he died maybe 10 or 12 years ago. And I thought so anything you would like to share with us, with me, about Walter, because he embodied the stuff you're calling all of us to. And to do that, let me read to you, and for the listeners, the very end of Bryan's magnificent book, Just Mercy, because it gets into the question, Bryan, what is just mercy? And what Walter taught you. So what I'm reading here is Bryan ends his book telling about what he said at Walter's funeral. Quote, I told the congregation that Walter's case had taught me that the death penalty is not about whether people deserve to die for the crimes they commit. The real question of capital punishment in this country is, do we deserve to kill? I told those gathered in the church that Walter had taught me that mercy is just when it is rooted in hopefulness and freely given. Mercy is most empowering, liberating, and transformative when it is directed at the undeserving. The people who haven't earned it, who haven't even sought it, are the most meaningful recipients of our compassion. Walter genuinely forgave the people who unfairly accused him, the people who convicted him, and the people who had judged him unworthy of mercy. And in the end, it was just mercy toward others that allowed him to recover a life worth celebrating, a life that rediscovered the love and freedom that all humans desire, a life that overcame death and condemnation until it was time to die on God's schedule. Tell us about Walter.
Yeah, Walter did teach me a lot. He was humble, he was honest, and he kept the faith. I mean, I was a very young lawyer when I started working on his case, and he believed in me. He gave me the confidence to believe that if he thought I could do it, then I have to think I can do it too. And there were so many obstacles in that case. I got death threats, and our office was getting bomb threats. So many people were angry that I chose to stand near him. But his spirit, his humanity, his dignity, his worth as a human being made me understand that standing next to the condemned, standing next to people who are hated, standing next to people who are disfavored creates an opportunity to harness grace, to harness love, to harness dignity, and create something beautiful. I think about my relationship with Walter, and it makes me smile because, we found a way to love one another and care for one another in circumstances that most people don't associate with love or compassion. And I think his whole community made me understand that when I represent someone on death row, I'm not just representing an individual. I feel like I'm representing all the people who've been wrongly condemned, all the people who've been unfairly accused, all of the families that have suffered and struggled in silence because their humanity has been undermined by misjudgment, by bigotry. And in that regard, it's a holy quest. It's a greater struggle than the parameters of a single case. And when we prevail, when we're able to win freedom, it feels like a bigger victory than just the release of one person. I've always been persuaded from the prophets, Micah 6, that God requires of us to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly. And Walter helped me understand the power of that, the urgency of that, the beauty of that. And he will forever be in my heart.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I'm so glad I asked you that you brought out about Micah. So one of your biggest fans is my friend who I did the first podcast with, the actor Martin Sheen, and I was telling him about you, and he just thinks your book is magnificent as it is, and I was telling him how much I love the movie. And I hope you'll laugh, Bryan. He said, I was so disappointed in that movie. And I just couldn't believe it. He was upset because he thought the scene that you have in the book, which doesn't appear in the movie, was one of the most powerful he'd ever seen. So I want you to tell a little bit about it, if you would. This is a story, it's almost in passing, really. One of the horrible trips you're making way out to the prison, and you get there and there's this truck and it's covered with the Ku Klux Klan bumper stickers and all of that. And then you get in there and meet the guard, and you just can't get any more horrible than this big white guy who's clearly like a member of the Klan and so forth. And he forces you into a strip search, and he's just about as cruel and inhuman as can be. And this goes on. You have to keep doing this. And then he brings, I think, Walter into the trial. He's there for 3 days. This guard hears the innocence of Walter, as I remember. And then you go back to the prison the next time, and he's kind of a different person. And Martin is very interested, like I am, in how that kind of transformation happens. It's really about Kingian nonviolence. Can you tell us that story and reflect on what it meant for you?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, particularly in the 90s, you'd go into these places, and there would be a lot of hostility. There weren't a lot of Black lawyers going into these spaces. And this was a particular day when I parked in the prison lot, and there was a truck covered with all of these bumper stickers that were just horrific. One of the bumper stickers read, quote, "If I'd known it was going to be like this, I'd have picked my own cotton." And it was alarming to me to see that, and the Confederate flags and the iconography of hate and resistance to integration plastered all over this truck. And when I went inside, this correctional officer was so hostile. He didn't believe I was a lawyer. He made me go into the bathroom and subject myself to a strip search, which no lawyer should ever have to do. He just tried to humiliate me. And before I went to go see my client, he made a point of telling me that the truck in the parking lot that I likely saw, that was his truck. And it unnerved me. And I actually wasn't seeing Walter that day. I was seeing another man who was very severely mentally ill.
Yes.
And he had all kind of issues. And when I got there, he asked me if I had brought him a chocolate milkshake. It was the first time I'd met him. And I just thought it was the craziest thing. And I said, no, I'm your lawyer. I'm here to help you in your case. And he seemed really despondent and disappointed I didn't bring him this milkshake. And then I realized he was suffering from mental illness and mental health problems. And I promised I would try to bring him a milkshake the next time. And that was the only way he could engage with me. And the prison never let me do that. And it finally was time to go to court in his case. And that hostile guard was in the courtroom, and he heard the testimony we presented over those 3 days about how this man had been in 29 foster homes by the time he was 10, about how he started abusing drugs to deal with untreated schizophrenia, untreated bipolar disorder, untreated psychotic conditions, and about the tragedy that surrounded the crime when he was hallucinating and psychotic. And the next time I went back to the prison to see this client, the guard was completely changed. And he didn't make me sign in. He didn't make me strip. He didn't do any of those things. He just took me to the door of the prison area, the visitation area. And then he stopped me and told me that he had been in court when we presented our evidence. And then he said, I just need to tell you that I think what you're doing is a good thing. And then he said, I realize that I'm a very angry person. He said, I didn't think anybody had it worse than I've had it. But listening to the evidence in that case, I realized your client had it worse than me. And he said, I just want you to know, I think you're doing a good thing, and I want to shake your hand. And I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
And I shook his hand, and I was about to go inside, and that's when he grabbed me by the arm. He said, oh, one more thing. I said, what's that? He said, well, on the way back from the courthouse to the prison, I took an exit, and I took your client to a Wendy's, and I bought him a chocolate milkshake. And it just moved me in ways that very few things do.
Yeah.
And when I got to see my client, it was the first time he never asked for a milkshake. You know, that guard left that prison shortly after that. But it's the reason why I believe that, we have to show mercy. We have to do justice. We have to love mercy for the undeserving, for the people who don't treat us the way they should treat us, for the people who are falling down, for the people who are struggling. And, that encounter reminded me of that. It reinforced that for me. And it's one of the many acts of grace and mercy and love that I see along this journey, which from a distance may look really horrible and painful and ugly. And there are aspects of it which are horrible, painful, and ugly. But in the midst of that, you also encounter grace and mercy and beauty and redemption and love. And that is absolutely what sustains me.
No, thank you. Wow. I know the time is coming to an end, but I got to ask you two more questions. One is, Bryan,
Okay.
I've been, so I'm an activist and a priest, and I've spent about a year of my life in prison, and I have many felony convictions for hammering on nuclear weapons and all. And all along, as a student of Gandhi and Dr. King, I have been publicly teaching around the world and in my books, as Gandhi said, that Jesus was the greatest person of nonviolence in history, and therefore all Christians are called to be totally nonviolent. And so, Bryan, this is why Paul Farmer was such an encourager of me, because, of course, every day of my life, Christians are telling me, oh, no, you got to kill somebody. So I just want to ask your thoughts about the nonviolence of Jesus and what it means to be on a spiritual journey. I think you're a Christian, I don't know, but Kingian nonviolence, gospel nonviolence, if Gandhi is right that Jesus is the greatest person of nonviolence in history, wow, everything has to change in terms of the religious-based, religious support of not just racism, but nuclear weapons and destruction of the planet, everything, all violence. What do you think?
Yes, I absolutely believe that. I absolutely believe that. I think accepting violence, participating in violence is a curse. And I think we become disconnected from the things that will allow us to get close to God. Living here in Montgomery, being a student of the civil rights movement, it was the commitment of people in this community to nonviolence that ultimately tore down the legal architecture of segregation. And in this moment where the politics of fear and anger, I think we have to talk more about our values and our character. I do not believe in violence. I think that violence is a pathway to destruction and abuse. It will create hatred. It will create burdens that it will be very, very hard to free ourselves from. So we have to commit to nonviolence. I think we have to commit to being against bigotry in all of its forms. We cannot hate. And I think we have to commit to appreciating one another rather than diminishing one another. And so for me, yes, that is essential to my faith. After emancipation, 4 million formerly enslaved people could have absolutely wanted revenge and retribution against those who had enslaved them. They could have chosen to seek violence against the very people that had separated them from their children and their parents and their spouses. But that remarkable community of people, faithful people, truly Christian people, chose citizenship. They started building churches. They started building schools. They said, no, we're not going to give in to the instincts that justify violence. We're going to show a new way. And I feel very connected to that narrative, to that community. My great-grandparents were enslaved in Virginia, but they rejected violence and chose education and love and faith. My grandparents were terrorized. They saw violence all around them, but they rejected that. Segregation is violent. Those signs that said whites only and black people to the back and all of that, they weren't just directions. They were assaults. They created injuries and wounds and scars. And many of us bear those scars today, but we have chosen not to retaliate because we know that that's only going to be a curse for us. Violence is like hate. It weighs you down. And so I absolutely embrace nonviolence as not just a philosophy, not just an orientation, but as a tenet of my faith, as an essential feature of what it means to be a follower, to be a believer, to be a faithful person.
Well, thank you so much, Bryan. Well, Bryan, I have about 50 more questions for you, but I can't ask them, so you're off the hook. But I'm going to ask you a last question about hope. So I'm going through your book, and all of a sudden you start talking about Václav Havel. I'm going to quote to you from page 219, the great Czech leader. And he said that the one thing people struggling in Eastern Europe during Soviet domination, the one thing they needed was hope. And you were very moved and inspired by that. And I'm not sure about hope these days in this terrible moment we're living through. But then you quote Havel as saying that there were a lot of things people wanted, but there was only one thing they needed, and that was hope. But it wasn't pie in the sky, and it wasn't optimism over pessimism, but rather, and here's your quote, an orientation of the spirit. The kind of hope that creates a willingness to position oneself in a hopeless place, which is what you've done, and be a witness, which is what you are, that allows one to believe in a better future, even in the face of abusive power. That kind of hope makes one strong. Tell me about that, Bryan.
Yeah, I'm persuaded by that. I believe that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. I think injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. So hope, for me, it's our superpower. It's the thing that will allow us to do the things that other people think we cannot do. I mean, I never imagined at the start of my journey that we would be able to help so many people, that we'd win cases at the U.S. Supreme Court, that thousands of people would get their sentences reduced based on some of our advocacy. I never imagined that we would create this landscape of memorials and museums and monuments that are calling people to recognize the harm of our history of racial injustice and racial inequality. And now hundreds of thousands of people are coming and appear to be so moved. And so I'm mystified sometimes by where I've gotten, but I am persuaded that my journey forward, wherever that takes me, has to be rooted in hope. I stand on the shoulders of people who did so much more with so much less. I don't feel like I can ever allow hopelessness to shape my thinking, to guide my steps. And my faith is rooted in hope as well. And so, yes, I absolutely believe that hope is the essential ingredient. It's the secret that we have to carry deep in our hearts. And the people who have blessed me the most, the people who have inspired me the most, people like John Lewis, people like Paul Farmer, people like Tony Campolo, who was a teacher of mine, I hear them still speaking in my ear. They are still in my heart. They're still feeding my soul. And the words they have for me are words of hope and affirmation. And that's what I want to give to others as I journey onward as well.
Thank you, Bryan. Is there any last thing you'd like to share with our listeners?
Just that I'm honored to speak with you, Father, and I'm so grateful for all of your work, your ministry, your activism, the beauty of your spirit. It's a real honor to speak with you.
Well, thank you so much, Bryan Stevenson, for speaking with me today, and I hope we can always be friends, Bryan, and whatever I can do for you, let me know, and I hope you'll speak with me again someday, because I have that rest of those long list of questions for you. So thanks,
very good.
Thanks, friends, for listening to the Nonviolent Jesus Podcast. You can hear more podcasts and find other upcoming Zoom programs at beatitudecenter.org. And please consider offering a donation to support this free work. And if you can, please leave some positive feedback or review on Apple or Spotify or the National Catholic Reporter. And join me next time, and may the God of peace bless us all. Keep on following the Nonviolent Jesus, everybody, and I'll see you then. God bless.